Welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Baxter and I'm the University of Georgia State Forage Extension Specialist. In this presentation, we're going to talk about how to make a weed control plan for pastures and hay fields. Now, all of this is more generally referring to our perennial pastures and hay fields, but a lot of the things that we're going to talk about do also apply to our annual fields. So what we are not going to do in this specific presentation is give specific recommendations for all of the individual weed species. That would take too long and it makes for a pretty boring presentation, to be honest. All of these are found in our Georgia Pest Control Handbook, and if you're listening in from another state, I believe most of them have a comparable document to this with labeling requirements for your specific state. Instead, in this presentation, we are going to talk about building a plan, an overview, kind of overarching, generalized plan for managing weeds on our farm. So I really like this term, integrated weed management. We've heard about integrated pest management for a long time, and this is just building on that. Integrated weed management refers to the strategies for weed suppression that combine information related to biology and ecology of the weed with all available control technologies. Now, normally when you're listening to a presentation like this, they say, think about the tools in a toolbox. And they usually show this nice shiny toolbox with complete sets of sockets and your 1/2-inch wrench isn't gone yet. All of those, it looks like we have a lot of tools available. But within forage production, our toolbox looks a little more like that one there on the right. We have to make the best out of the options that we do have, recognizing that we have very few options. And so our options can be very limited, and so we have to be strategic. And we're going to talk through each of these 4 in greater detail. They're introduced here on this slide. We're going to start with physical and biological control, add more detail to cultural control, and then the bulk of the presentation will be spent on chemical control. So with our physical control options, this refers to things like mowing, harvesting, or even grazing. We tend to discount these options, but they really do work best for us during periods of seasonal transitions when we have both warm and cool season weeds showing up. If our plants are stressed in any way, they can be more vulnerable to herbicide injury, and so we want to be more aware of using those products when our plants are coming out of drought stress or cold stress. Sometimes Mother Nature's not cooperative and we just can't get sprayed, and so that's where mowing really comes in. Or if we have really mature weeds, like the image that you see here on the left. I stole this quote from Twitter several years ago. I wish I could find the original tweet that showed this particular example next to a 6-foot tall pigweed plant. But it said, for everything there is a season, and the season to control that weed was 6 weeks ago. And so sometimes a shovel or a bush hog is our best option. We tend to jump to herbicides, but we do have other options out there. Talking briefly about biology or biological weed control, we're using that weed's biology to our advantage. So our pre-emergent herbicides must be applied before those weed seeds germinate, which is often several weeks ahead of when we're starting to even think about those weeds showing up. Ideally, post-emergent control is going to be when the weeds it's young and actively growing, and so we'll talk about those in a little more detail later. And then some weeds that we would call like rhizomatous weeds, like Johnson grass or Vasey grass, are going to be more susceptible to herbicides when they're starting to shut down in the fall. And so that's going to be kind of late August, early September for a lot of us in the deep south here. And so it's not saying that we can't get some control earlier in the year, but we're just going to get much better control when Mother Nature is working with us. So one that I really enjoy talking about is cultural control. Our ground cover is the best defense that we have against problematic weeds. There's several different things here. Just to hit one of the big ones is cutting or grazing on time, making sure that we're controlling pests and scouting for any issues. We leave good residual to promote good forage regrowth, and then making sure our soil pH is good with the lime applications and fertilizing, especially with potassium in the case of something like Bermuda grass that you see in the picture there. Anything we can do to make the good grass grow better is going to help us win the battle against weeds on our farm. So while we may need the herbicides to get started, it is very rare that I give an herbicide application or a recommendation and do not discuss cultural control options. Otherwise, we're going to have the same problem or maybe even a worse problem in future seasons and future years if we do not fill in that ground with our good grass that we're trying to keep growing. So, shifting now to the bulk of the presentation, which is our chemical control options. They can include, some different types of applications, but it's much more complicated than just providing a chemical name and a rate. And by far, the most popular question I get in a given day is usually a text message with a blurry picture of a weed, and it says, "Hey, what's this? How do I kill it?" Period. That's all the detail that I often have to go on. And the reason that I don't like giving recommendations with that limited information is because the likelihood of me recommending something that's not the best fit or can kill grasses that you consider beneficial to your farm, it's very, very likely. A wonderful example of that is this left-hand picture there. Luckily, this happened on a research farm and not a producer farm, but I got the call that said, "Hey, we got a bunch of crabgrass out here. Can you bring me something?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." Went and dropped the chemical off, wrote the rate down, and left. And then get this picture a few days later. And so with this particular product that was sprayed, it should not have been applied when the temperatures exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, summer in South Georgia, if you've never been here, we exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit quite often. And so it actually was very injurious to this grass. And so had that label been read in the detail that it provided, it would have been known that this product didn't need to go out on that particular date. We needed to wait for the temperatures to come down. And so that is why we ask so many follow-up questions to encourage you to read the label with those chemical control recommendations. So with those options, you'll hear us say this a lot in extension. We have to control at the right rate and the right time. We have to follow every single label direction. They all are important. And so that includes things like the rate, time, and the growth stage of both the plant and the weed that you're trying to kill. And then our grazing or harvest restrictions that we need to be aware of. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And then is there anything that you need to mix in, or is there a certain order that you need to mix? We should also be cautious about applying herbicides when our good or desirable plants are stressed, because an herbicide that is normally safe can have negative effects at that time if we're not careful. So we have options for both spot spraying and broadcasting, and these, granted, are two very extreme examples. It's no question we should be spot spraying or digging those thistles up that you see on that left-hand side. There's some dog fennel back there, a little bit of everything. Whereas here on the right, that's no question we want to broadcast that. We don't want to go in and spot spray. But sometimes it's not as clear cut. There are a lot more options that we have available to us. if we do spot spray, especially when we're talking about killing weeds out of something like tall fescue or bahia grass, where we just do not have a lot of selective weed control options, we may recommend spot spraying just with glyphosate or something else that can be injurious or kill out what we consider our good perennial grass in that case. So this is a question that will come up quite often, and it's usually more relative to increasing product availability rather than, saying, could I spray, do I need to spot spray this, or can I broadcast, and vice versa. Now, when it comes to the different herbicides that we have, they can all be broken up into these the group numbers that correspond to a mode of action. And it looks like we have a lot of different chemicals out there, but we don't actually have that many modes of action available. And then even within one mode of action, there's the different families of the herbicides, but we'll see multiple products that have the same active ingredient. And so I really like to know what you have tried in the past, especially if you're saying, I've just had this weed for years and nothing seems to work. Well, I need to make sure that we're not dealing with a case of resistance and that product was put out at the correct rate, correct time, and so on. And so sometimes we have the right product, it was just being put out in the wrong way. And then other times we do have a documented case of herbicide resistance, and I don't want to recommend something in the exact same active ingredient or sometimes with the same mode of action, because we want to be changing this up and trying new things if needed. Now, I understand that herbicide labels are not the most enjoyable reading, but there are precautions and restrictions on there for a reason. And so if it's a product that you're new to, I really encourage you to sit down and read that information. I like to pull them up on my computer screen so I can zoom in and not have to squint down for a small label, especially on some of our tiny bottles of herbicide. But this is a really important sections for avoiding our injury to non-target plants. So what are we trying not to kill out there, or what do we want to avoid injuring around us? What replant intervals do we have? And what is required? How do we need to clean out our sprayer, and more things? So there's a lot of very important details that I encourage you to review before putting out that herbicide, especially if it's the first time you've been working with that product. Something that I get a lot of questions about is the tank mixing or maybe even impregnated fertilizer. And so I encourage you to read all the pesticide labels very carefully for the mixing order. I get a fair number of calls on this, and I'm really glad that people think that I am smart enough to remember them. I'm sorry, I do not. I'm happy to help our extension agents work through this if they're not, this is their first time kind of reading those pesticide labels and understanding that tank mixing and so on. But we've got to check the label for that. We also want to consider the time of year and the stage of growth before we start mixing those products. So I get the question a lot of, can I put this herbicide out with my fertilizer? Or could I put the herbicide and the insecticide out together? And a lot of times we have to ask, does our grass need those two products at the same time? And so a lot of times we tend to put fertilizer out too early just to put out that herbicide or vice versa. And so we want to make sure that we're putting out the products when our good forages need both of those materials or whatever we're putting in the tank. If we're still not sure after reading that label if two things can mix, then I recommend mixing them in a clear cup or jar to see the reaction. You can see a lot of different examples of this on YouTube and university web pages where they can show some of the antagonistic effects of the products when we put them in the wrong order. And it's one of those things that takes a few minutes of effort, but it's so much cheaper to just throw that out, and your time is worth, that 5 minutes is not worth a lot in the grand scheme of things versus having to replace a sprayer or even your grass if there is some sort of antagonistic effect between those products being mixed improperly. So with our crop specific information, again, this is all going to be on that label. We want to make sure that we're using the specific use rate, application timing, time of year, rotational shift. All of those things are going to be critically important in that weed control plan. It's going to vary by crop or weed species, and so we want to make sure that we're properly identifying everything out there, and not just guessing for what weeds or what good grasses we may have. A really important thing to note is we cannot exceed the labeled rate or number of applications per year. And so we want to be sure that we keep really good records for what has been applied to the field. It helps not only keep us within the legal requirements for the label, but if something's not working, then I can have all the information I need to know what didn't work and how can we improve this going forward. So a bit of a vocabulary lesson here. This one's a little easier than what's coming on the next slide, but I do want to take some time to break down these words as we begin to wrap up here. So our re-entry interval, or REI, you've likely seen that through a lot of pesticide training courses and so on. That is when you can re-enter the field safely. Ones that I talk about a lot are our grazing restrictions or our hay or harvest restriction. The first one is when the livestock can re-enter the field, and the next one is when you can safely harvest hay or that material again. Now, please note, every one of these intervals may be different. Most re-entry intervals are fairly short. A fair number of our herbicides do not have grazing restrictions, but some of them can have up to a month. So we do want to be aware of where these products are going to fit into our grazing plan as well. And the grazing and harvest restrictions are not always the same. Some are greater for one than the other. So again, we need to make sure that we're matching the product that not only is the best for the weeds that we're trying to control in our grazing system, but also how does this fit in our grazing system, in our hay system, with our respect to our harvest or our grazing events. So the intervals that can be a little more challenging to understand, I know they were for me, is our different terms that we use for residual. Now, residual activity is usually what we're talking about, and it's how long is a product effective on the target weed species. So we're going to use pigweed for this example. How long after we spray that pigweed plant do we, one, control that pigweed, but two, prevent new pigweed from coming up behind it? So that's normally what we're talking about when we say residual. However, there are other residual terms on the label with respect to our plant back that we'll get to next that we need to be aware of, especially with new products coming to the market that have very long, what we would call soil residual. Now, this is the length of time that the herbicide remains active in the soil. It may not be at a level that can control what we would call a target weed. In this case, we're using pigweed as our example, but it can still cause damage to off-target plants. So we sprayed our product, we killed our pigweed based on this residual activity, and for a few months after, for this particular example, let's say, we didn't see new broadleaf weeds start to show up. However, over time, we're starting to see our target weeds that, our pigweed and other broadleaf weeds start to show back up. But, so not only are we not getting control of those, but we also can't plant back certain crops yet because of that soil residual. And so that's where we get into the plant back interval. That is the minimum period of time between when that pesticide is applied and the planting of our next crop. Now, all of that is probably about as clear as mud, and I know it took me a really long time to be able to see how those kind of connect. I understood it much better after looking at a graphic like this. So this is one from out at K-State where they looked at the herbicide concentration over time. And so when we first put out a particular herbicide, it was at the lethal concentration for our tolerant crops. So we are killing the weeds that we wanted. So let's say in this case, pigweed again. As over time, as it starts to come down, we're starting to see less control from that product, but we still have a lot of soil residual there. So even though we're not controlling pigweed that has a very high rate up here, we would still see injurious effects if we wanted to go in and plant alfalfa or clovers, because they are very susceptible to those herbicides. And so that's why we may start to see broadleaf weeds return if we're not doing good cultural control to keep that ground covered after we remove that initial weed. But it also means that we can't go in and reseed certain things or overseed our fields, whatever it may be, if the product has a very long soil residual, leading to those delayed plant back intervals. So again, all of that information is going to be on the label, and can be a little hard to find. That's why I like to look at them on my computer instead of on the actual label on the bottle. But it's very, very important in terms of where we fit within bigger forage management planning. The reason we talk about this so much in forages is that when we start to see concerns for planting back in the fall, so if we wanted to go in and plant fescue later or ryegrass or other winter annuals, even some broadleaf products have a delay before when you can go in and plant back a grass. And then there's ones that we often use for grass control can be 4+ months. Legumes tend to be a lot more susceptible to herbicides overall, and so just some examples. Again, don't make sure you're looking at the actual label at the time you're spraying for updated numbers on all of this, but sometimes it takes 12 to 24 months to get that product out of the soil before we can go in and plant a very susceptible crop like a legume. Several do recommend a bioassay before we plant, not just a set number of months. So we want to be aware of that limitation before we start putting out our herbicides so that we're not impacting grazing plans in the future. So when we start to make our chemical control recommendations, step one is always go in and identify those weeds so that we know exactly what we're working with. After that, we want to determine what herbicide is needed. And again, we pull those from the UGA Pest Control Handbook. But then I really like to take it one step further to identify what management changes are needed to prevent the weeds from reappearing. Otherwise, we're going to be having the same conversation year after year after year. And that's not economical or sustainable in the grand scheme of forage management planning. So important questions that I like to ask before I make an herbicide recommendation is, what are the desirable species out there? Now, overall in my research, I focus a lot on Bermuda grass hay production, which means I think crabgrass and ryegrass are some of the worst things out there. However, if you're listening to this and you are a cattle producer, you know that crabgrass and ryegrass are very desirable forages for cattle. They gain really well on them. They fill some important kind of forage demands throughout the season. They work very well in a grazing situation. And so I don't like to assume what is the desirable species out there. I want the producer to tell me, what are we not trying to kill? And it's not always possible to get the weed control that they're looking for without losing some of those desirable species. But if there is an option available, we need to explore that. And so that's why we spend a lot of time on these questions here. Again, related to the identification is what weeds are we dealing with? It's usually more than one, and so if there's 10 different weeds out there, I want to know what's the 2 or 3 that you are most concerned about, and can we identify a product that's going to cover more than one weed, or do we need both a grass and a broadleaf post-emergent herbicide? So what options do we need to explore? Again, to reiterate this fact, I like to know what's been done before. So, one, I could make sure that we have the right product, but more importantly, that we do not have a documented case of herbicide resistance, because we do know that those are increasing, especially for certain modes of action in certain weed species. And so I don't want to just keep recommending something that's not going to work. And so that's why that record keeping is so critical. And then finally, we just touched on this briefly, but what do you plan to plant this winter? We can't go in and recommend herbicides with very long soil residual if you're planning to overseed in a couple months, or you had planned on replanting your fescue or whatever it may be. And so we want to make sure that these herbicide plans fit into your planned planting and grazing schedule, or can we start to work around that and what do we need to modify to get some of these problematic weeds under control? So some common mistakes that I do see with herbicides is that our pre-emergents tend to go out too late. Our warm season weeds start germinating much earlier than we think that they do. And so we got to make sure that our pre-emergents are going out before any germination starts to occur. Our post-emergent products need to be applied at the correct stage of growth, and all of that's going to be available on the herbicide label. Overall, we tend to apply products way too late, just because we're not seeing them before there's a good flower or seed head on there. And so to get ahead of that, as we start to go into summer, at the time that I'm recording this presentation, we want to check to see where are we seeing those cool season weeds start to head out right now. And that's a really good indicator of where we're likely going to see warm season weeds here shortly. So it can help us start to hone in our scouting for those. And then finally, if I didn't say it enough, let's just say it one more time. We've got to follow all label instructions for the rate, mixing order, things like adjuvants that we need to mix in, and so on. I see a lot of mistakes made here just from kind of carelessness and rushing to get to the field. Sometimes we just need to take a moment and evaluate our options. So if I could distill down weed control into one slide here, this is kind of our snapshot weed control management for the state of Georgia and honestly a lot of the Southeast. Our annual broadleaf weeds need to be controlled when they are 2 to 4 inches tall. The challenge is our recommended stubble or grazing height for a lot of forages is about 3 to 4 inches tall, which means these can really blend in. That's why scouting ahead to see what weeds are there kind of now during the off season can help us identify what's going to be there in the future. So if we've missed the timing for whatever weed you're looking at now, there's very likely going to be one that comes up just in the opposite season. And so we can get ahead of those if we know what we're dealing with now. And that can really help you kind of zone in on where you need to go scout for these, so we're not just having to dig around and look for weeds all the time. Overall, our annual grasses are much more easily controlled with our pre-emergent products compared to a post-emergent product. And so these would include things like crabgrass and ryegrass, things that they do have some post-emergent options available, but a lot of them just have a low efficacy, or the products are going to be very injurious to our desirable grasses. And so we do want, if we are trying to control those, we really need to discuss a pre-emergent plan. And generally speaking, we're looking at this more with respect to hay production, especially Bermuda grass hay production than the other systems. So we do have some pre-emergent options available, but we do need to discuss those if we're talking about overseeding or anything, how does this going to fit into a bigger plan? And finally, our rhizomatous weeds, things like Johnson grass, Fazy grass, and even things like horse nettle, are much better controlled in what we would call the early fall. So generally that's kind of late August, early September, depending on the year. When Mother Nature's starting to slow the plants down, they're more vulnerable to the herbicide than they would be during other times of the year. So it's not saying that you wouldn't get some control outside of that time period, but if you're only going to get one application on that, and can only budget out for that one application per year, we want to make sure that we're getting the best efficacy of that product possible. And so that's going to be during that time point for those rhizomatous weeds that have those really big, dense underground root systems. So again, that was a good bit of information there related to herbicide planning. Again, I recognize it's not an all-inclusive presentation with respect to weed control planning. We do have our Georgia Pest Management Handbook available through the UG Extension web pages that gives you more specific recommendations for the different products and the different weeds that are out there. I strongly encourage you to work with your local county extension agent to identify the weeds, and then they can work through the state specialist to identify what the best options are for that and really tailor it to your farm. So again, there's a lot of information. If you do email me, my email is on the slide there. I do ask that you give me your name, county, and which state that you're in, so I can connect you with your more local extension representative so that we can get a plan that's tailored to you and your farm. So thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.